Our next speaker is Professor Siegfried Zielinski, who will be exploring the legacy of Ibn al-Haytham from a media archaeological point of view.
Okay, let's see what's possible in 20 minutes, and the 20 minutes are pushed already, so it might be, in my imagination, 5 minutes. I try to do my best. Perhaps if you allow me one or two remarks from somebody who comes from a completely different field than most of you. I think cosmopolitanism has not the best time at the moment, but cosmosciences could be something we can feel at home. At least I feel at home in cosmosciences, in this imaginary place, which in German I would call Heimat. The second remark, I think for most of you a term like media archaeology must sound like something from the moon or some other planet. Perhaps I should just give you an idea how it all started in my research. In 1984 I wrote my dissertation on the history of magnetic video recording at the Technical University in Berlin. At this time in 1984, most of my professors didn't even know what a video recorder was. And since then, I always tried in my research to be a little bit forward to the time the established knowledge had been. And my work as a media theoretician regarding deep time developments of art, sciences and technologies helped me a lot to take this kind of place in the scientific community. After listening to my colleague already, who has such a wonderful and much more expanded knowledge on Ibn al-Haytham, my decision for this short speech not to talk so much about al-Haytham's text themselves, but more about the way how I gained the knowledge about it and about him and other scholars within the Islamic heritage. I think this was the right decision. Just at the beginning, this is something I would need an hour to explain what I mean by that in our context, but it helps perhaps just to show this slide. I had the privilege and the luck to study in this institute. The correct name of the institute in translation was Language in a Technical Age. It was founded in the year when the wall was built in Berlin in 1961 for purposes which I need to explain. Perhaps I can do that later. It was a very important gesture by the Technical University of Berlin to do that in this year. And you can see 1961 there was a close interconnection between the 22 faculties at the Technical University which were dealing with mathematics, engineering, physics and so on, and a small faculty of philologists and poets. And this is where I decided to study. I did not want to study philosophy, poetry, linguistics in a classical university. In a humanities university. I wanted to study it in this context. And this was an extremely important decision for myself in my attempt to approach what media and techno-based communication can be about. You can see here in 1961, this is the first periodical, the first issue of the periodical this institute was publishing. There are already themes like automatic translation, counterplay of image and language. If you go through all the manuscripts, which are so wonderful and so beautiful, George has given us a great insight again into some of them. This interplay of text and image, which we think this is absolutely new for the 21st or the last decades of the 20th century, are of course ancient in a specific sense, and it's extremely important that young scholars who are moving through the present and a possible future are able to understand that. By the way, as a media archaeologist, I practice something which I call prospective archaeology, and this means that the students, the designers, the artists, the engineers, the programmers I'm working with have to learn to interpret it and understand the old to be able to create the new. Very simple. The best way to teach young people how to understand, for example, the science and engineering in the Muslim heritage is to make them rebuild the machines. Very simple. It sounds very simple, but it's extremely effective. When we went through this wonderful project here, I can pass the book around a little bit. Some of you are present here in this catalog. When we did this project on Allah's automata, for example, we rebuilt the Banu Musa, as I said, the first audiovisual computer, universal machine for steering other music machines. And the students did a great job. It ran through the whole time period of the exhibition, and they learned an enormous amount of things by reconstructing the machine. They learned what universality in the thoughts of the Banu Musa was. They learned how to program something with very simple mechanical devices. You don't need complicated electronic devices to do that. You just need a very good brain and some very good ideas, and then you can do it. You can knit a computer if you want to do that, and many other aspects. So this became extremely important for me to start to go through the knowledge and through the artifacts in this closest proximity to construct them, respectively to reconstruct them. What helped me also very much in understanding that in my study at the Technical University was a writer named Max Bense. I think none of you will know him. He wrote his dissertation on quantum physics and relativity of being, which was a critique of Heidegger in the perspective of quantum mechanics in the 1930s, 1936. And then after the Second World War, he became one of the most interesting experimenter with language, with linguistics and poetry. The titles of his early books, Programming of Beauty, 1960, you must imagine, or Precise Pleasures from 1964, were blasphemic to the poets and the literature scholars in Berlin and elsewhere, because he dared to bring two different worlds together, the world of poetry, of aesthetics, and of programming, of informatics, and thinking grammatically on high levels of ordering of grammar. This was extremely important to learn that these two worlds are not excluding, but they are integrated. We had some discussions already about things like beginnings and firsts and so on. I skip, by the way, the manuscript. I think is the best. Otherwise, and you just say when I sold my 20 minutes, and then I will stop. What helped me to understand that it does not make much sense to work with the first and with the notion of origin in the area of media research, of studying media and communication, technology-based communication, was the work of a very famous geologist, James Hutton, in his Theory of Earth from 1795. He was jumping out of the narrow cage of Christian dogmas to understand the age of the world, and defined the age of the planet much deeper in time than it was imagined until the middle of the 18th century. This is where the term deep time was coined, which for my own research became so important. Why? Because when you started to study media and techno-based communication, you were confronted with the 19th century basically, and the 19th century of course in Europe. This was the invention of photography, of the cinema, the start of techno-based communication, telecommunication, telematics and so on. Of course this is nonsense, and as we know, the deeper we go in time to investigate forms of communication, of technologically based communication, the more we have to widen our horizon in thinking these kind of fields, in thinking these kind of subjects. I skip the part now on the camera obscura, where I would have gone back to Giovanni Battista della Porta, dear George, and to some other authors. We skip that because it was mentioned already, and I don't have the time to really go into details. This is the fourth book of Giovanni Battista della Porta's Magia Naturalis, in which he defines the dark chamber, the camera obscura, which he called camera cubiculum, which was much closer to Ibn al-Haytham than other terms. The dark chamber in which you can see the objects from outside projected onto a wall in color, and so on and so on. He goes very detailed through it. Joseph Needham was mentioned already. He is a great fan of Shen Kuo and his treatise Meng Chi Pi Tang, which also contained, shortly after Ibn al-Haytham, quite a nice description of a camera obscura, and of course all the rest is quite well known. One who was not mentioned in the context of optics yet is Francesco Maurolico from Sicily. I put him here on one of the slides also because you can simply see that the model here on the right hand is what I call the master model in modern optics. This is Ibn al-Haytham, more or less, with some modifications by Maurolico, which was then picked up by Kepler with nearly in the same shape, you know, much better than. Can we perhaps turn these lights off here, then we can see the slides a little bit better. On the left top you can see the master model again. This is from 1604. This is, by the way, something, George, I would have liked to discuss with you, but we can do that perhaps later. I wonder if a term by Walter Benjamin might help to understand why so many scholars are using specific artifacts and visual objects. This term is Denkbilder in German, thought images, or thought images, I think, is the best translation. They are helping to think. They are helping to think complex things, and they are coming up again and again and again in history. They work like prostheses, like imaginative prostheses to develop an idea and an argumentation. And the master model by Ibn al-Haytham definitely is such a Denkbild, such a thought image. The whole historical discussion I have to skip, which is a pity, because I think if we criticize how the West and the European North has constructed the history of sciences over the last, let's say, 2 centuries, we definitely have to include a critique of Hegel's idea of the gradation of the world spirit, which he, 5 minutes, which he wonderfully gave as a series of lectures in the 1830s in Berlin. You can see the construction here very clearly. Orientalism, the origin, so to speak, of world knowledge is starting on the right hand in the east with China, India and Persia. And then extremely interesting here, the way he describes Mohammedanism. It works for a long period of time as an interface between the Oriental and the Occidental knowledge, but then suddenly it veers away. When it comes more to Europe, when it comes to Germany, when it comes to the highest level of complexity, as Hegel said, Mohammedanism is going into another direction. And this, I think, this is, let's say, in the middle of the 19th century. This is the master model of how the history of sciences was created. It's linear, it's hierarchic, it's, in my opinion, very weak. And it made me doubt, like many other things, it made me doubt if somebody like Hegel was really on the maximum of scientific progress in the 19th century, or if he was not thinking backwards. When you compare such a model with, for example, Al-Farabi's dynamic model, how knowledge was distributed between, let's say, the 800 and the first turn of the millennium, you have a completely different picture. This is dynamic. The picture is not linear, it's circular. You have ellipses, you have circles as the main symbols for developing, for the genealogy of the knowledge, and you have, and this is of course a very important point why we are so much engaged in history, you have also the possibility to come back to a specific point, which of course is not the same as it has been centuries ago, but this passage of going back to a specific point incorporates possibilities of going into the future. Al-Farabi, for my own research, for my work, became something like a master model. This is a time machine. I can interpret this kind of demonstration of how knowledge was generated and distributed as a time machine, which helps me a lot to understand history. Now I would have gone closer to Ibn al-Haytham, and I can't do that anymore. I just want to make a very important remark. Please don't misunderstand me. I've read quite carefully Sabra's work. I even communicated with him quite a lot on various issues before he died. I know A. Mark Smith's work quite well. I know Lindbergh, and I know all this stuff which has been written about Ibn al-Haytham. But I did not fall over Ibn al-Haytham through these books. I fell over through completely different sources, which has to do with my study at the Technical University of Berlin. Because I studied the Orientalists, I studied these people who were working mainly in translation. Wiedemann, Barmann. This is a text which I read already in the late 1960s, early 1970s by Wilbur Schramm, Ibn al-Haytham's Path to Physics, Ibn al-Haytham's Weg zur Physik. And you can see here already, this is how we got used to as students to understand the texts a little bit, even if we had not been able to read Arab. He was going into the Arab terminology all the time. You see now the completely ridiculous thing that I translated the German text into English. Of course, the original text is German, but you can see how he fiddled around with the different concepts, and he gave us the possibility really to dive into this world much better than Friedrich Riesner and his Latin translation, which was, as we know, less a translation, more an interpretation of Ibn al-Haytham, and it was missing very important parts of Ibn al-Haytham's work, especially those parts which dealt with the artifacts, with the instruments and with the experiments. Riesner had no idea of this experimental basement in Ibn al-Haytham's thinking. What you pointed out so wonderfully, he discussed him in a more philological way, opposite to a much earlier dissertation by a scholar named Barmann from 1882. This is the Zeitschrift der Deutschen Morgenländischen Gesellschaft, a wonderful periodical which is of course not existing anymore. Barmann again, and this is how we started to study these kind of people, the Arab text, the German text and the discussion of the terms. Here you see how I got electrified. I just copied this page from, I don't know, 30 years ago for you, how I had been electrified. Every second medium or every third or fifth term is medium, 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 medium. This is the way how Barmann translated body. What was in Wiedemann's text body, the body of refraction, the body of reflection, and so on and so on. Here Barmann used medium, and this is how I got electrified. What is that? What is behind that? Ibn al-Haytham, and this was a literature which was already 100 years old. Wiedemann commented on this text very extensively, again discussing terms. Here you see then the shift from the term medium to body again to Körper in German, and so on and so on. And of course you have all the the sketches which you know from the original literature. Wiedemann, who also discussed wonderfully in a text from 1907 Ibn al-Haytham's text on the nature of shadows, which helped me again to understand also what the Mohists were writing, whom you mentioned on the shadow. This is from Fuad Seskin's work. You will be very familiar with that. I wanted to at the end to discuss the wide range of experiments, of experimental artifacts, of instruments of observation which al-Haytham has developed and has described as something which is absolutely fundamental for what I would call modern science. I would even go so far, and this is a little bit of thought provocation, that I would define. This is from Gerald and Traumüller, History of the Physical, History of the Art of Physical Experiments, Geschichte der physikalischen Experimentierkunst, a book I really admire a lot from 1899. Of course, he goes very deeply also into Ibn al-Haytham and his experimental based thoughts. But what I wanted to point out at the end is that Ibn al-Haytham for me is not only a modern thinker when I conceptualize modernity as a specific attitude towards the world, but we can even name him provisionally and experimentally as a postmodern thinker. Why? Because his concept, his basic concepts of visual perception created something which you can call, with a contemporary term, inter-objectivity. The object was not anymore, I think colleague Bernard also talked in a specific way about that when he talked about things, but now he's sleeping so he can't hear me. Inter-objectivity, that means the object is not passive anymore. It's not just reflecting the light which I throw as the divine subject out into the world. The object becomes active. It becomes a potence, a potentiality. There you are very close with Avicenna and his whole idea of the attractiveness of things. And this is very, very, very thoughtful to think about that, because this is now constituting modern, very, very contemporary media theory. The whole notions about the Internet of Things and so on is about interopjectivity, and the idea that the objects are active, that they are as active as I am, and it's all about dialogue and interconnections. Thank you very much. Sorry for being too long. Yeah, I should explain that. The starting point was, of course, the cut through the eye by Buñuel and Dalí. It was also a cut through the cow's eye. I must show the other picture too, of course. This is Al-Ibadi's the illustration of the cut from the 9th century. And these two cuts of the eye changed the world of seeing. Buñuel Dalí changed the world of seeing in the cinema, and of course, Al-Ibadi changed the world how we looked on seeing as scientists. Thank you.
Thank you very much.